Welcome to the Medical Imaging for All podcast, brought to you by Clarius Mobile Health. This show is dedicated to exploring the trends and technologies shaping the future of medical imaging. Here's your host, Ohad Arazi, CEO of Clarius Mobile Health. Now, let's jump right into today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to another episode of our podcast. Today, I'm joined by Subh Bhattacharya, who leads healthcare and life sciences at AMD, one of the largest semiconductor companies in the world. Subh is a longtime technology leader in the microchip, IoT, and platform as a service spaces with a deep interest and a profound understanding of healthcare. So before we dive into the episode, Subh, could you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ohad, for having me on your show. As you mentioned, I'm the worldwide market lead for healthcare, medical devices, and life sciences at AMD. And here, our team is responsible to grow our presence in the space, and we support our customers building medical systems like yourself, and also developing, evangelizing, innovations, solutions for the future. I actually have been in the technology industry for, it's going to be close to, it's 25 years or more. And I come from the computer engineering background. I used to design microprocessors back in the days for Intel and Sun Microsystems. Moved on to more product planning, then product management, more on the marketing and product management side, into servers and then into embedded, and worked for companies like PMC, MIPS, computers. And then I made kind of a little bit of a sharp move towards the healthcare side in the middle, and did a startup. I'm doing a very modular healthcare information system platform. It was actually eventually acquired by a hospital in Asia. And then I spent some time in pharmaceutical side, doing combination medical devices, public access for auto injectors, EpiPen. So at that time, it was quite a bit of work around the different US states, margin on the laws, working with the FDA. And then did a second startup, and this was acquired by GE Digital. This was around IoT and combination of healthcare and a couple other areas. And then about 7 years ago, I joined what's now AMD. It used to be Xilinx before. And I've been basically driving most of our initiatives around healthcare medical systems and life sciences here at AMD.
That's fascinating. So really well-balanced career, a few startups that you led, big corporate as well. I'm kind of curious, what drove you to lead that first company in healthcare? I mean, healthcare is such a difficult industry. You had a strong computer background. You could have gone into any domain. I think many of them are less painful than healthcare. It feels like we're pushing a wet noodle up a hill every day here in healthcare. What was your interest in this space?
Yes. So actually, it was a little bit, you can say, opportunistic. One of my relatives, my uncle, he had been in cancer research for a very long period of time. And he basically was, he used to call himself half a physician. So he used to work with doctors around the world, and they had some specific requirements from a, kind of a range of clinics that were developing around the South Asia region. And they wanted me to help out. And I kind of took a dive, kind of quit my job to start something on the information system side, working with IT and putting together a system. And, back in those days, you wouldn't see, there were, the IBMs and SAPs of the world doing some stuff around healthcare, but it was very expensive custom development. So we kind of decided to kind of, try something out on our own. And I basically set up a team to do some development. Most of the requirements came from the physician community. We had several physicians in the board and as consultants to help out. And it kind of worked out, except what happened was the economy took a major downturn around 2009-10 timeframe. So eventually I had a plan originally to scale that, but I couldn't because there was an issue with funding and stuff. And I got an opportunity for an acquisition, a private acquisition through a hospital. And they actually deployed it, and it worked really good. And then, as far as I know, for several years before they moved on to more modernizing systems. So that's how I landed up there, and I started developing more interest around, finding out what's going on the healthcare side. Eventually, started knowing more about, medical devices and healthcare technology application within imaging and the clinical side, things like that. And that kind of led to doing some of the work around the, combination medical devices with the pharmas.
I think that in of itself is an interesting space, right? At kind of the confluence, the convergence we're seeing of like, what used to be really very different domains, right? Like biopharma is bringing in med device, is bringing in digital health, and kind of together, you're creating these much more diverse ecosystems to better serve, either, drug developers or providers or patients. So that continuum has been, I think, really evolving in a very interesting way. And no doubt from where you sit today, you have a very broad view on healthcare because AMD serves so many different types of healthcare enterprises. And maybe that begs the question, what is AMD, a semiconductor company, doing in healthcare? Why does AMD need a healthcare lead?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a very valid question. They do get asked that question quite a bit. I mean, overall, as people know, AMD is a good, brand name out there, known for its processors, graphics, and PCs, data centers, servers. Gaming is a big one. But today, most of the presence we have is in the embedded systems using what's called our adaptive system on chips, which houses our field programmable FPGAs, which you're familiar with. We're kind of brain behind many diagnostic equipment, like, according signal data, beamforming, ultrasound, image processing, 2D FFT, MRI, back projection, CT, image reconstruction overall. We're also in surgical, like robotics, surgical robotics. We hold actually like a dominant market share in robotic controls and visualization systems for surgeons in video augmentation. We're in handheld devices like yours, which are driving, very high performance ultrasound, for example, and power efficient SoCs behind it. We're in medical PCs displays. We're in, you go to the airports, you see all those AEDs. We're in majority of those AEDs. We're in ambulatory defib monitors, in vitro machines, everywhere. So previously, as Xilinx, we were very much in the FPGA space, which now has evolved into adaptive SoCs. Now, with AMD, we have a pretty much end-to-end solution for healthcare. Actually, if you look at AMD x86 processors are in workstations that connects an ultrasound machine, for example, right? Or graphics cards doing rendering, visualization of the images and data. So it is a very strong area for us, both from the business and the strategic perspective, and it has high visibility within the company. So we're kind of interesting position to grow this business. And as you know, AI is growing and we have a very sharp focus on AI. So AI and healthcare, obviously there's a strong convergence there as well.
No, absolutely. When I joined Clarius and was learning more about our utilization of your semiconductors, it was very interesting to find out how much is happening real time. And as you're kind of explaining the variety of use cases where AMD is being used in healthcare, it strikes me that a lot of that is real-time processing, and which is super interesting because, it lends itself to such different outcomes than what we're maybe more used to, at least I am, where kind of AI was being processed in the back office, usually after image acquisition. So, maybe just to talk a bit about my background in this space, I was the CEO of Zebra Medical, one of the really first AI medical imaging companies, where we were basically taking images that were acquired by CT, X-ray or mammography machines, and then processing it offline on big cloud servers to try to render either an initial diagnosis in order to triage the study, or otherwise to start to detect conditions and kind of perform a recommendation that would streamline the interpretation process for the radiologist. This was very expensive, first of all, because we had to run big models on big cloud servers, and it was always post-processing, which to me lended to a little bit of less of a value ultimately for the users, because if it's happening non-real time, then its actual impact on time savings or productivity enhancements were somewhat limited. And when I came into ultrasound, what was really attractive about using AI is that AI was being done real time to help improve image acquisition. It's also helping with interpretation, but the main motivation is to basically help novice users acquire higher quality images by allowing the AI to help, stratify the anatomy, segment it, perform measurements real time, or help indicate on how to position the probe. And of course, that takes tremendous computing power, but it's, you can't send that to the cloud. It's being done as the image is being acquired. And that's, I think, a really unique aspect of the utilization of the AMD systems and this kind of whole concept of system on chip. How do you see the imaging AI space at large? I know you've been very active in that at AMD.
Yeah, so I think you touched on really the critical points here because obviously AMD, we have our GPUs and the HPC systems doing the training, which is done in a cloud environment or an HPC. But then the real critical element of this here for this type of application is going to be the inferencing, what you call the edge, or it could be the endpoint, right? And for that, using smaller appliances like handheld devices, point-of-care devices to do real-time inferencing is critical. Now, if you look at like the past, we were primarily at Xilinx doing field programmable gate array FPGA devices, which are programmable devices. So it was all implemented in hardware, and it does give you the determinism, latency, and the determinism both for applications. And if you have enough horsepower, you'd be able to process that and deliver very low latency or real-time results. As the processing requirements have gone up, we've kind of moved into more we're calling the adaptive SoCs, right? So if you look at like some of the latest generations where we're combining, the scalar of like pure processors like ARM or, mostly ARM right now, as well as x86 on the AMD side. But along with the FPGA, we have added in the whole new architecture now called the AI engines. And this AI engines are basically, it doesn't stand for artificial intelligence. AI stands for adaptive intelligent platform. So this AI engines actually are, these are what's called SIMD VLIW processors. So these have these are capable for single instruction multiple data, and then it has very, very, very wide set of instruction, right? And then you have these in a tiled architecture where you have a lot of these, like up to, let's say, 400 of these small tiled processors on a single chip, all with the local memories. So now you can sort of like the GPU, where you can like break up the task in parallel tasks, and you can push a very, very high amount of data through the system where you're not going off chip into external memory. And then the combination of having the FPGA or the programmable portion of the logic, the DSP blocks, and the AI engines, creating this where you could potentially do, real-time, beamforming, signal acquisition, beamforming, and then at the same time, you can do some pretty complex AI algorithm processing and outputting everything instantly, right?
That timeliness is very important. Maybe just to take us to another aspect of it, which I'm interested in, which is the space, heat, and power constraints, right? Because a lot of, again, the examples you're giving are in AEDs and things that are very real time, very small, real medical devices that are being used in the field. I'm sure a lot of innovation then has to go into that, not only to have strong processing, but do it in a very space, power, and heat efficient manner. Is that also a big constraint that you see in this space?
Absolutely. So I think, like I said, these devices that are at the edge are, smaller appliances. So performance over power is what typically I would say is one of the most important measures. Now, yes, there are large scanners like an MR machine or CT scanners that may not care that much about power dissipation. Though I think, I have heard this from a physician a long time ago, is saying that, you put a patient in a small room and you have a large fan running, it's very uncomfortable. So I would rather see that, a lower power. So yeah, you want to reduce power there as well. You want to also meet energy star requirements for this, but for handheld devices, like you can't heat it up, it'll burn your hand. That's one thing. Then there's a question of conserving battery. If you're going point of care, you're going out to a rural area with the, OBGYN application at the handheld ultrasound, you definitely want to conserve the battery for a long period of time. So there's, methodical amount of technology going in power efficiency and power management, implementation of what we call voltage islands, where you can, turn off, on and off things within the chip as they're used or not used. So effective management of power is very, very critical, along with space, right? There's also a question of, how much can it fit in a particular device when it comes to handle. So yeah, with technology, chips are getting smaller and packages getting smaller, getting more efficient, but at the same time, you want to, you're putting in more and more logic, and, so you have to save space, you have to build it economically, and you have to conserve the amount of power you're dissipating and amount of energy you're using up. So that is, I think, one of the advantages of, I would say, an adaptable SoC that we work on versus, let's say, a GPU definitely is in power dissipation, right? If you look at some of our latest like personal system on chips, and you're familiar with this, our CEO recently announced at CES that we developed this medical imaging libraries, and this medical imaging libraries, they provide the building blocks for a lot of the beamformers and or X-rays and CT machines, but it also does some reference designs. What we're trying to do there is to improve productivity when people are going towards more software-based adaptive beamforming, for example, right? But it's also, if you build a system and you basically implement a very, advanced algorithm, like using synthetic aperture or planar waves, spherical waves, where you're trying to target, focus on the image onto the whole organ at once instead of going, serially, you are using up a lot of power, right? If you look at an implementation of virtual SoC versus a GPU, it's like 1:5 or 2:5 ratio of participation. So those are some of the significant advantages for applications at the edge, implementing AI, implementing very high performance imaging algorithms, for example.
We've spoken about AI, and again, you have a front row seat at seeing this AI industry develop in medical imaging. What are your thoughts in terms of the resonance of, like, is this really creating value, or are we still kind of in the earlier stages where it's a nice gimmick that we're processing things through machine learning and AI, but it's not really yet driving clinical value? I'm trying to get my head wrapped around it myself.
It is a question that everybody has maybe a different answer, or depending on who you ask. I think first of all, there are more things that needs to be done, right? So what we're looking at, you have to have like data, right? And data is managed by HIPAA and other things. So having access to data for research, more has to be done. I'm finding it's a little bit still difficult when it comes to people trying to do research and having access to large amount of data. And one of the things you have to do is to increase the accuracy, right? So increase the accuracy means basically it has to be the volume of data. Having said that, but there is so many applications that is starting to see advantages already. Like, for example, what we see diagnostic assistants, right? X-rays, huge volumes, right? Like something like 2 billion scans a year. And there have been studies showing that it's not the question of expertise, it's a question of fatigue and not enough radiologists. So actually doing some sort of ROI, region of interest selection of X-rays using AI as an assistant is definitely a huge benefit, right? In your area, we have customer, and not specifically your application, but we did ultrasound. These guys have been developing non-imaging ultrasound-based applications, and they actually have a full AI-based implementation doing kidney bladder volume measurements. And this has been it's FDA approved. And originally they were using software, and they moved the whole thing to hardware. And now it's on the device in real time. And now they're cutting down hours and hours as just the clinicians, nurses walking around the hospitals could just leave it there. The AI gives the results in a few minutes. It's just amazing. I mean, where you see.
I think both of those examples are really good because they're touching on two elements where, humans are more prone to inconsistency or, to your point, fatigue. I always think about AI not as kind of the pilot, but as the autopilot that is alongside the pilot on that long transatlantic flight, right? I still maybe want the human to do the takeoff and the landing, but I recognize in between that, there's like 12 hours of paying attention to a million different parameters that are very mundane, very repetitive. And that's really an area where I think AI can be very powerful. I think X-ray in particular, when I was at ZebraMed, we were often focusing on CT, but the reality is that, especially in the US, most CTs get read very, very quickly. And it's more X-rays that are more run-of-the-mill, especially like plain films, chest X-rays, volumes are extremely high. And, in many jurisdictions, like you were talking about, Seth, Asia, India, many X-rays don't get read. Even in the NHS, studies are showing that X-rays don't get read. So if we could really come up with models that help to rule out a condition, to basically say, our AI has read the study, no need for a human to read it. The FDA is still not there, by the way. The FDA still requires it only to be a computer-aided diagnostic, and there's no rule yet for a full rule out. But I really do agree. I think that those are really good examples, and certainly things like measuring volumes, which are just so prone to operator variability, right? Everyone measures it a little bit differently, and therefore it's harder to track the disease state progression. So those are two excellent examples, and interesting to hear that you're working with a company that's doing that. on a non-imaging basis, meaning they're not generating an image, but they're just automating a measurement, which makes a lot of sense. Why need to look at the bladder if you can just have a number that reflects the volume of that bladder?
Absolutely. And I think even on the surgical side, right, there are applications which can be immediately used, like, for example, setting alarms for, if you're cutting a blood vessel by mistake. And it is really not a risk, right? You're actually trying to mitigate the risk through AI here. So it should be a little bit easier for FDA to say that, yes, that's a great application. Or if a surgeon is looking at all these images and then during the surgery, and you use AI to choose the right filter. Task that does not need to be done by humans, and it definitely doesn't pose a risk towards it, right? So there are, I think these are some, but again, if you look at like the whole new classification of SAMD, and I'm sure there is an effort out there, but just not the deregulation, but easing up the regulation is probably going to be helpful.
I agree, and I think the FDA has been progressive, certainly relative to other regulators. But it's also interesting what you're talking about is, leveraging AI for non-FDA or for applications that don't require FDA clearance, like, for example, for training or for, optimizing the view, like the example you gave on presets. That's something that's very common in ultrasound. Ultrasound historically was prone to a lot of buttonology, right? You really needed to be an expert, like a sonographer, to know how to adjust the gain, the depth of field, the contrast, a lot of knobs if you've ever had a full ultrasound done on one of those big carts. Whereas I think in reality, AI is very powerful, not so much for automating the diagnosis in ultrasound, but for selecting the right preset. As you move from organ to organ, they're in a different depth of field, and the AI can know that automatically. And that doesn't necessarily require clearance because it's an aid for a human performing the task, and a little bit more like that autopilot analogy.
The autopilot analogy was a really good one. I'll use that someday.
Excellent. And I'll give you another one, which I don't take credit for making up, but I've heard often, which is like specifically in radiology, there's a saying that says, AI will not replace radiologists. Radiologists that use AI will replace radiologists that don't. And that, I think, is very analogous to that autopilot model, where I think we'll see more the emergence of like a cyborg, of like a mix of the human and the machine working together to streamline the workflow. And you and I both know, healthcare is such a mix of art and science. It's not only one or the other, right? And therefore, I think that some meeting of the minds of the creativity and the uniqueness of how a human is looking at a situation, coupled with the automation that a machine learning can provide to automate or to measure, to provide consistency or to avoid errors in error-prone areas, is maybe where we'll see this evolve. But certainly very, very interesting. And I was going to say, it feels like our lives right now are also really rich in AI conversations because of the advent and all these natural language models themselves. Is that also something we've talked about? Image processing. Is natural language also an area of interest for you or generally for AMD?
Obviously, we're focused on our hardware and silicon, and we've been working quite a bit to create a software framework and stacks. And on the healthcare side specifically, we actually have put out this what we call the Model Zoo, and we're targeting cytology or hematology, different models that could be taken and modified. They're all open source. So there's a concerted effort for different applications. And again, this is not just for healthcare. I mean, because as a company, AMD overall is very highly focused on other applications where AI is dominant and is going forward, like automotive, for example, right? Significant amount of investment going in. So here also we're definitely working towards developing models that could be replicated pretty easily and taken out. But again, our focus still remains the hardware. Yeah.
Absolutely. Good. Well, I know that you are a bit of a futurist as well. And certainly from the vantage point from where you sit, you probably have a lot of thoughts around where generally is technology going, and maybe specifically where is healthcare technology going. Could you talk to us a bit about that? What are some of the maybe more disruptive thoughts you have around where's all this going, and maybe what role could companies like yours or companies like mine play in that disruption?
I think from the technology perspective, AI seems to be like on for the decade, right? For the next 7 and 10 years for maturity and spending on that. And from the healthcare perspective, one of the areas that I feel that we're still a little bit behind is cybersecurity and implementation of cybersecurity from all the way from the hardware level to the network level. And then lack of regulations or lack of enforcement there has created a little bit of a mismatch there as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of initiatives while we merge AI into mainstream platform from the equipment makers as well as from independent software vendors and also from the hospital administrator, right, where you see like a sort of what we call a convergence of IT and OT. OT is operational technology. So, for example, one of the things I think about and talk about quite a bit is if you have your electronic medical records, and as per HIPAA, you're protecting the data in a certain way. If there's a large-scale attack on a system, your first approach would be to shut the systems down to protect the data from being stolen or being corrupted. But if you have equipment that is running, an operating room or an ICU, you can power that down. So now you have different set of priorities within your IT/OT infrastructure. It's a real challenge for administrators. So I think there is going to be a lot more technology developed from the node perspective there in terms of security, safety, availability at that level. And when you see the equipment makers, their internal customers are the service providers who are doing some level of system integration for hospitals, and IT are also defining what it is needed, and their requirements may or may not be matching, in terms of what they want from the security perspective and others. So some of those areas, I believe in the next 5 years will be addressed because it is becoming more and more urgent.
Maybe let's unpack that for a moment, because I think it is fascinating, right? What used to be considered like dumb devices, edge devices that didn't have a lot of processing power, now are supercharged by these system on chips, and they actually have a lot of data on them or flowing through them, which of course means that they're a much bigger risk. I remember several years ago, I'm probably getting the hacker conference wrong, but at one of the hacker conferences, there was like a demo of how someone was hacking into an insulin pump. That was just, I think, eye-opening, right, for us as an industry to recognize that like all these connected devices, all these operating technologies are actually, posing risk, as opposed to more of a legacy thinking of like kind of the server where the records were stored was the main point of attack. But actually now it's much more widespread. And so interesting to hear you talk about that while these devices are evolving, they're also becoming riskier. Is there a solution for that? Is there like, can you lock down the IoT? Like, is it at the OS level? Where does that really get addressed?
We as a company, we're starting to address it from the root of trust and from the hardware, from the base level, right? So there are many ways to do encryption, decryption from the hardware perspective. So we have actually a security engineering center of excellence within AMD, which actually addresses specifically each market-wise. Providing a solution that is kind of more end-to-end or bottom to top, right? So when you provide some of these hardware to our system makers and implementation on the software that we're providing along with that will get easier to merge on to the systems at the system integration level, right? So that's the goal. Having the ability to isolate, for example. You guys are using our MPSoC, the power domains, right? So one of the goals there is that you run some application code on ARM processors, and then you have this other R5 real-time processors, which can be completely isolated and running a medical critical code, right? So those are things that we're doing proactively for some end markets, which requires this level of security, along with, there's the safety aspect as well, which is different again between medical, between industrial, automotive. We are kind of geared up to even help with advanced safety for the future as well, which is, we follow certain standards that caters to space and military and aerospace safety standards, automotive safety standards. So, right now you as OEM are responsible to submit a 510K and you do all the qualification work and everything. But we also have the background of doing testing and stuff, which can help as required if the onus starts falling on the suppliers more and more.
definitely covered a lot of ground today, right? From your background spanning healthcare and technology, deeper into what AMD is doing in the space. We talked about AI and cyborgs, autopilots, and certainly I think you've opened my mind to think more about where is security going as we continue cybersecurity, as we continue to supercharge these devices, right? And we have smaller and smaller devices that are doing more and more complex processing and have more and more data flowing through them. Certainly learned a lot. Before we start to wrap up, Subh, if our audience wants to learn more about you and your work or what you're doing at AMD, where should they go?
So they could go to our website at amd.com, or xilinx.com is still an existing website where you will find a lot of information on our applications, solutions. I personally, and we have our LinkedIn page as well on AMD, which has the same. And I personally have my LinkedIn page where, my background is there, as well as, I keep posting, articles we're working on or different webinars we're doing and things like that. Yeah, so I think it was this absolutely super opportunity. It was really great to talk to you. And since you gave the autopilot example a couple of times, I do want to point out that I'm a pilot, 1,000+ hours.
Wow.
And I would love to have some assistance while I want to sleep for long flights,
Amen. Well, I got lucky. I struck a chord there. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Subh. I certainly learned a lot today. And frankly, we need more people like you. We need more people that are super passionate about technology and are integrating that into healthcare. And I love that meeting of the minds. And that's where it's all heading. So keep doing what you're doing. Would love to remain a great partner of yours. Thank you very, very much for your time today. And then to all of our listeners, we always enjoy our time together, and be sure to catch us on the next episode of our podcast. That's a wrap.
Thanks for listening to the Medical Imaging for All podcast, brought to you by Clarius. If you enjoyed today's show, please do us a favor and leave us a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. For the latest episodes, please visit www.clarius.com or search Medical Imaging for All on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks again, and we'll catch you on the next episode.